If you're trying to build decks that feel better to play, then this video is for you. Building around a mana curve might be something you loosely understand as something you should do, but don't really understand the how. My goal with this video is to explain that how, so you can build decks that feel better to pilot. I'll tell you this, it's not a secret. It all starts with your mana curve. Using probability, your mana curve answers the question, how likely are you to draw a card and then be able to play it? Now, you might be wondering what a mana curve is. Put simply, a mana curve outlines the earliest you will draw and play a card equal to your total mana. After all, if you can cast a card that costs the maximum mana you have access to each turn, you're going to be playing the strongest card you can. It's easier to learn this concept with a real-world example, so I'll be using my Rivaz of the Claw deck to break it down. In this deck, there are 17 possible cards I aim to play on turn 2. According to Salubrious Snail's calculator, this means I'll have a turn 2 play 83% of the time. By itself, that number doesn't really tell me anything. Is 83% good? Should it be more? I chose 80% as a benchmark for how low I'd be willing to go for my odds on turn 2, but it could have been anything. What matters is that I chose this number. The mana curve helped show me I hit it. What I mean is that deck building is subjective. There isn't an omnipotent rule saying you have to build a deck a certain way. A large part of deck building is simply testing your hypothesis. It's important to mention that risk tolerance plays a large factor when you're making a conscious decision like this. For me, 80% was great. I'm okay with missing a turn 2 play 20% of the time because it doesn't hurt me too badly. Turn 2 is more of an accelerator. However, some deck builders are much more risk tolerant and would be okay with 60% odds, as that's still technically favorable. Of course, there's the other side of that coin of deck builders who might want that number to be closer to 90% or higher. An important part of this step is determining how comfortable you are with missing the play and building from there. Playtesting is very good at showing if that random number you've chosen is total shit or not, or if the play you're worried about is even important. Getting back to business, turn 4 is the most important part of the early game because it's when this deck aims to play its first dragon. What are the odds that will happen? 95%. I identified this as the most important turn of the game for this deck and wanted my odds to be significantly higher. Because my risk tolerance is lower for the result I'm looking for here, my curve needs to reflect where success is coming from. In this case, from mana costs 4 through 6. The deck I'm using as an example has kind of a weird curve though. How does that curve output 95%? Let's look a bit closer. Ramp equals more mana equals more cards you can play equals better odds equals couple question marks equals profit. It's basically impossible to get Rivaz out early on turn 2, unless you've got a Soul Ring. With that in mind, I completely ignored the idea of doing so. This allowed me to create an extremely smooth piloting experience. I'm playing a card turn 2 nearly every game, Rivaz on turn 3, and a dragon on turn 4. But wait, there are dragons here that are more than 4 mana. 5 to 6 mana is more than we'll have access to with only 4 lands on turn 4. It's probably obvious where I'm going with this, but casting Ramp on turns 2 and 3 allows me to play more expensive cards. You know that's what Ramp does. But why is this important? Especially as it relates to the topic of this video, mana curves. Because by gaining access to more expensive cards, it opens up the pool of cards that I can draw and play. A 5-drop on turn 4 is no longer dead in hand, meaning it factors into the probabilities I was just working through earlier. I don't need 23 4-drops, I'm able to branch out to stronger, more expensive dragons. Of course, none of this is guaranteed if I'm not ramping with lands. Hint, I'm not. Any one of these ramp pieces could eat removal and throw a wrench in my plans. Let's look at how that impacts the golden 95% I've established. If Rivaz is removed and I don't ramp on turn 2, there's only a 52% chance I have a 4-cost dragon to play. If Rivaz is removed and I did play ramp on turn 2, that number shoots up over 30%. A couple things stand out here. When Rivaz is removed, the difference between 1 mana is a 33.7% swing in probability I can play something. The difference between Rivaz being removed, but I ramp turn 2, and Rivaz not being removed is 12.2%. And finally, when Rivaz isn't removed, the probability between 1 extra mana is 2.1%. Rivaz being removed before turn 4 is the greatest weakness in this deck, but it does an excellent job of outlining how ramp plays a role in unlocking your mana curve. All of this data informs the decisions I make early. However, if you've never truly built around a mana curve, like myself leading up to this point, chances are you've never realized why your mana curve matters. I could just jam 40 dragons in here and call it a dragon deck. The largest swing in probability is off the back of 1 mana, not even the 2 rivaz provides, meaning early ramp is really important as a failsafe, and I should probably be playing those mana rocks on turn 2. To be honest, I should probably add a few more after looking at this data. By examining what this deck wants to do early, I was able to fill in cards around that game plan rather than just jamming in stuff that looked good on EDH Rec. A smoother early game means a stronger late game. Stick with me, turn 4 is important. On turn 1, the options in this deck are pretty simple. Did you hit Soul Ring or Faithless Looting? If yes, play them. If no, pass. It's that simple. When turn 2 comes around, we've got a few more options. As I alluded to earlier, these 2-drops are pretty important. There are 2 things I'm aiming for with this turn 2 play: a looter to help fill our graveyard, or a ramp option. It doesn't necessarily matter which of these is being played, although the data we looked at earlier suggests a ramp spell on turn 2 is actually pretty important. I'll often mulligan a hand that doesn't give me a turn 2 play, even if the card quality is pretty good otherwise. I knew rivaz would be my turn 3 play, so I did the most logical thing. Cut all but 1 of the 3 costs in this deck. I ended up cutting 6 cards when I did this. They were actually some of my favorite cards in the deck, and also some of the strongest relative to their mana costs. So why did I cut them? Because these 3-drops were insignificant in my hand for the first 6 turns of the game. With 8 of these 3-drops in the deck, I would draw one before turn 6 69% of the time. That isn't good, especially if it comes at the cost of a 2-drop on turn 2 or a dragon on turn 4. The only 3-cost card I kept was Toxic Deluge because it's a great board wipe, can close the door on aggro decks if it's needed, and is basically never played on turn 3. On turn 4, my goal is to play a dragon. There are 6 4-drops, 9 5-drops, and 8 6-drops for a grand total of 23 dragons you can play on turn 4. As I mentioned earlier, that's a 95% chance to hit with rivaz on the board. Here's one more quick example. You generally want to play Pantlaza Sun's Favored as soon as possible. Pantlaza costs 5 mana, meaning you want to be ramping on turn 3 at the latest in order to play it early on turn 4. However, 31% of decks play Migration Path and 14% of decks play Skyshroud Claim. Why? Neither of those cards accelerate the goal of getting Pantlaza out on turn 4, and while the extra mana certainly isn't being wasted later, it's inefficient. This deck's goal is getting a dragon on the board on turn 4. Rivaz merely accelerates that plan, which is why I built the deck around everything leading up to turn 4, rather than focusing on playing Rivaz a turn early on turn 2. I believe that every deck has a pivotal turn where it wants to do something, whether that's simply casting the commander or going for something more elaborate. Identifying your deck's goal is the first step in determining how your mana curve works in your favor, rather than working against it. Turn 5 and onward is really where my careful planning ends. The deliberate intentionality of what should be played on each turn no longer really matters after this point. You're just playing Magic. Maybe toss down a big recursion spell like Patriarch's Bidding if you've been board wiped, or if you have a big board presence, try to slam that Scourge of the Throne. This deck is full of huge creatures that can end the game once they pile up. You're playing Battle Cruiser-ish Magic with big scary dragons. To close, what did we learn? First, we learned that mana curves are a probability game. Understanding how the math works removes a lot of the guesswork from every aspect of the deck, from building to playing. Next, we learned that ramp allows you to manipulate your mana curve. Doing so ensures you can execute your game plan on the earliest turn you're aiming for. An over-reliance on ramp can also have the inverse effect. Remember, I only hit a dragon on turn 4 52% of the time if I don't have any extra mana. And last, we learned that your early game is often the most important part of your game. For some decks, that's the first 2 turns, like my Goblin deck. For others, it's closer to turn 6 or 7, like my old Zombies deck. Video coming soon on that one. It's often far more than a missed land drop that's causing your early games to suffer. If you haven't watched my other Rivaz video talking about the other cards in this deck, I highly recommend doing so. I basically talk through why I included most of the cards in my Rivaz deck, and it pairs well with the information you gained by watching this one. Thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.